After the rebels took over, all of that went into ruin and the city fell into decline. So now that government forces have retaken the city and life appears to be getting back to normal, we're going to be looking at the areas and how they were affected during the war and now today moving forward. The battle for Aleppo was one of the major turning points in the Syrian war. It began in 2012 and carried on for 4 bloody years until 2016, when terrorist factions were forced to retreat and give up the city. The damage to the city is indescribable, with tens of thousands of buildings being totally leveled by years of constant shelling. International efforts to bring peace to the city were totally ineffective. The UN and Western governments urged President Assad to surrender the eastern part of the city to Islamic terrorists, essentially giving them free rein to control the territory. But that was unacceptable to the governments and the people living under the so-called moderate rebels, which included the CIA-backed Free Syrian Army, al-Nusra Front, and other al-Qaeda-linked groups. While international experts claimed that it was only fair that President Assad give up control of Aleppo and let the rebels take over, a very different picture emerged when I visited the city. I talked to a number of residents in Aleppo, and they told me horror stories about life under these moderate rebels that the UN and Western nations supported so strongly. Not one resident said they were glad to live under the rebels, and said that for years they had been starving to death with no work, afraid to speak out or do anything but hide from the rebels supported by Western governments. The residents who lived there told me these were not freedom fighters, they were simply terrorists. I visited the once mighty industrial city on the outskirts of Aleppo. It's difficult to overstate the importance of this area, an economic powerhouse that drove the entire Syrian economy. Tens of thousands of workers called the Sheikh Najjar Industrial Center home, and the textiles, plastics, and other goods manufactured there provided billions in exports every year. All that was lost when the city was captured by terrorists. Some 55,000 people worked in the city prior to 2012. But now, barely 3,000 are left. But the city is rebuilding. I was able to tour some of the factories that have reopened since the war. One recycling factory was particularly hard hit. The workers there refused to give up, and even when they were completely surrounded by terrorist forces, they boarded up the windows and worked by flashlights at night so the rebels couldn't see them. The factory is now back to full capacity and collects waste from around the city to create recycled paper for cardboard boxes used in shipping. The story is similar at other factories, such as this textile plant, where some of the famous Damascene cloth is being produced again. The workers say they're grateful to have jobs again and that under the rebels, life was unbearable. Now, however, security provided by the government is giving them the chance to return to work, earn a living, and contribute to Syria's once booming economy. Under rebel control, many areas were bombed or captured, and even these banks were converted into prisons for the Free Syrian Army and al-Nusra Front. During my trip, I also met with a number of senior executives overseeing the reconstruction of the industrial city. They told me that at its peak, the city was turning out over $50 million in goods every day. For a country with an annual pre-war GDP of $40 billion, that's a pretty significant chunk. They explained that once the city fell, the entire economy of Syria was impacted, plunging by a mind-blowing 40%. That's the equivalent of the U.S. losing all of California, Texas, New York, and Florida. And even more interesting, once that happened, the value of the Syrian pound plummeted, while the value of the U.S. dollar in the country went skyrocketing. It's enough evidence for some analysts to say that there were more Western interests at play behind the fall of the city than might first appear, especially since the Free Syrian Army, supported by the CIA, was the primary force responsible for destroying the city. Finally, I toured the old city of Aleppo, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that was utterly devastated by the war. I visited the Umayyad Mosque of Aleppo, which was built in 715 AD. However, the Free Syrian Army used the mosque as a base of operations, destroying the historical minaret and assaulting the rest of the city. I also walked through the world-famous Aleppo Souk, an ancient marketplace dating back to Roman times. To say that it was ravaged by the war doesn't come close to the destruction I witnessed there. Buildings that were thousands of years old were torn to pieces, with only crumbling fragments to hint at their former glory. The rich heritage of an entire nation, heritage for people all over the world to appreciate, was desecrated, wasted in a bloody battle with no winners. There I met with a local business owner whose home was captured by terrorists during the occupation. He was forced to flee, but he's since returned and says the rebels used his home as a staging area for attacks. It suffered badly in the war, but now he's repairing the old Roman building and hopes to host tourists someday soon. He says that under the rebels, normal life was simply impossible.
Now, if you look to villages and you look to the part which was under the domination of terrorists, no teaching, no schools, just teaching them how to shoot, how to kill, and how to be intolerant with the others.
Some media groups have shown interviews with Syrian people who say that they are grateful for President Trump and they are grateful for the attacks on their cities because they want to be freed from under Assad. What do you say to that?
Unfortunately, the most of them, they are paid to say this. Just paid. The rebels, they were supported from outside just to make problems in Syria. It was no reason, and even I don't want to talk about the rebels. It was no rebels, because everybody had a good life. It was no reason, absolutely no reason.
I don't know what other reporters who come here are told. I don't know what they see. I can't say that for them. I can't speak for anyone but myself and the Syrians that I talk to. I only hope that there is a chance to get this message out, to have other people stop and consider their viewpoints, because nothing I have seen has matched what was presented on TV. And I think that that's a massive problem for the Syrian people who are hurt by reports that aren't accurate. What's happening here in Syria right now is not what I see on TV elsewhere. And I only hope that there's a chance for these people who are hurting and are suffering and they're trying so hard to live a normal life. I hope that there's an opportunity for them to do so, and that other journalists will come and try to report these stories as well and show that life in Syria is normal. It can be normal, and that these people just want to live a normal life like everyone else. Reporting from Damascus, I'm Pearson Sharp.